here again with Doreen Moore, and this is the second part of a three-part series. So if you didn't see part one on Doreen Moore, please watch that. And we're talking about her book, Good Christians, Good Husbands. And I think the subject matter is so intriguing because it's about some of the Christian leaders from past centuries and what their marriages were like, both the good and the bad, and what we can learn from them for our own lives today. So we'll be talking about the second man, the second leader today. And Doreen, why don't you just take it from there?
Okay, thanks, Mary. All right, hi again. All right, today we're going to talk about George Whitefield. And George Whitefield is one of my favorite people in history, but I'll let you judge about his marriage. He was born in 1714 in England. He said that the Spirit stirred in his heart when he was young, but he really wasn't a Christian then. He went to Oxford University when he was older, and while he was there, he met Charles Wesley, and that's when Charles Wesley gave him a book called The Life of God and the Soul of Man, and by Henry Scougal. And that little book changed George Whitefield's life because he realized for the first time that Christianity was about a new birth, that we needed to be born spiritually. And so he became a Christian, and from that moment on, George Whitefield's sole passion and purpose in life was to glorify God by telling people about Jesus Christ. So George Whitefield went everywhere. He went to England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. He came 7 times to the American colonies and preached up and down the eastern coast. George Whitefield was absolutely committed to being an itinerant evangelist and telling people, preaching the gospel. George Whitefield, over the course of 34 years of ministry, I think I mentioned this in the last video, but I'm not sure. He, in the course of 34 years, preached 18,000 sermons of 1 to 2 hours each. He preached to about 4,000 to 5,000 people at a time, sometimes crowds up to 30,000, and that's all without modern sound systems. He gave himself completely and utterly, entirely to his message about Jesus Christ, so much so that afterwards he'd so expended himself that it was said he frequently vomited blood after preaching. So he was definitely very dedicated. He once famously said, "I would rather wear out than rust out." Many of you maybe have heard that quote before, and I'll tell you, wear out he did. He did not rust out. He definitely wore out. John Wesley saw him 5 years before he died. He wasn't yet 50 years old, George Whitefield. And John Wesley looked at him and said, "He is an old, old man, worn out in the service of his master." But weakness, sickness didn't deter George Whitefield. One time, everybody around him thought he is dying, and yet he still traveled 1,100 miles and preached every single day. George Whitefield also had an orphanage, and he couldn't help it. His compassion was so strong for the orphans that he would go out, and any orphan he saw, he would bring them to his orphanage in Georgia. And he once said, it's very clear that this orphanage caused him to take years off his life. He once said, "But if I had suffered less, others would have suffered more." And so I just think that's wonderful, his compassion for the orphans. George Whitefield also had a wife. Her name was Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was a very godly woman. She was very committed to the ministry. Like John Wesley, George Whitefield believed that his call was to be an itinerant evangelist, and nothing was to deter him, and that marriage was subordinate to his call to ministry. Unlike John Wesley, Elizabeth Whitefield accepted this. She knew exactly what she was getting into. She knew that George Whitefield married her to help in his ministry, not because he was passionately in love with her, but because he needed someone to help with his ministry. She knew he married her because she was a godly woman and she would understand and never try to slow down his travels. And he never did. At one point, he even called her his widow because he was gone so much. And I think this part is kind of sad. At one point, she said, "I have been nothing but a burden to him." And I think is kind of sad to think about. She also, she knew she was getting into a marriage that was not going to be romantic or passionate. And we in 21st century life. We think romance and passion is so important in a marriage, but George Whitefield called it a foolish passion, and he knows nothing about what the world calls love. So he definitely was not into that. But she knew, and she accepted all this. Now, when I was growing up, there was a movie, a Western, maybe some of you will know it. It's called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And oftentimes that phrase comes into my mind when I think about the three marriages of the three men we're talking about. Jonathan Edwards, who we're going to talk about next, was clearly the good. John Wesley was clearly the ugly marriage. But George Whitefield, every time I talk about this subject or people comment on having read that chapter in my book, they'll question, was it a bad marriage or was it an acceptable marriage? Bad because George Whitefield still didn't live up to his responsibilities as a husband, but acceptable because they both agreed. She went into it knowing exactly what she was doing and what she was getting, being married to a man such as George Whitefield. So, whether we could call these marriages the good, the bad, and the ugly, or the good and acceptable and ugly, I'm going to leave that with you to debate. Thank you, Mary.
That is so interesting to think about how our different times and cultures affect how we perceive our walk with God, our relationships, and it helps us to think today about not seeing maybe through the eyes of our times or our culture, but more just in a different way. So we will even hear more of that in part 3. But until then, thank you, Doreen.
Thank you.